Privacy and anonymity might be important for our social and business well-being, but authentication is essential. Authentication is about the continuity of relationships, knowing who to trust and who not to trust, and making sense of a complex world. Even non-humans need authentication, but other species than humans usually use smells, sounds, and touch. Arguably, life itself is an authenticating molecular pit of enzymes, antibodies, and so on. People authenticate themselves many times in a day. When you log on to a computer system, you authenticate yourself to the computer. In some sense, the computer also needs to authenticate itself to you, otherwise, how do you know it's your computer and not some imposters? Story time. Consider the average man on the street going to buy a Bratwurst. He examines one storefront after another, looking for one that sells Bratwurst. Or maybe he already knows his favorite deli and just goes there. In any case, when he gets to the store, he authenticates it. He looks that it is indeed the correct store or one that does sell Bratwurst. The authentication here is sensory. He sees Bratwurst on the menu, he smells it in the air. Our man then talks to the deli man and asks for a Bratwurst. To some degree, both need to authenticate each other. The deli owner or the deli man wants to know if the customer is likely to pay. If the customer is dressed in rags, the deli man might ask him to leave or at least to pay beforehand. If the customer is wearing a balaclava and brandishing an AK-47 rifle, the deli man might run away. The customer too is authenticating the deli man. Is he the real deli man? Will he deliver me my Bratwurst, or will he give me some sawdust on my bun? There's probably some sort of certificate of cleanliness signed by the local health inspector on the wall somewhere if the customer cares to check. More often than not, the customer trusts their instincts. We've all walked out of a restaurant just because it didn't feel like the right place. The deli man hands over the Bratwurst and the customer hands over a $5 bill. Then more authentication ensues. Is the bill authentic? Is the Bratwurst looking good? We are so good at visual authentication that we don't even think about it, but it is something that we do all the time. The customer gets his change, checks to see that it is indeed correct, and put it in his pocket. If the customer paid using a credit card, there would be even more behind the scenes authentication. The deli man would swipe the credit card through a reader, which dials into a service center and makes sure the account is valid and has enough credit for the purchase. Attacking authentication can be very profitable. A story from quite a while back, a man called Thompson Sanders was convicted of defrauding the Chicago Board of Trade because he dressed up as a non-existent trader, complete with a wig, a beard, and a fake ID. This fake trader would place large risky orders, then claim those that were profitable and walk away from those that were not. The brokers on the other side of the losing transactions were unable to prove who they made the trade with, so they were responsible for the losses. Anyway, let's return to our Bratwurst story. Let's say another customer walks in. And this customer, this time a woman, she and the deli man are old friends. They recognize each other. They authenticate each other by face. Face recognition is a very robust authentication system. People recognize each other even though you might have a new hairstyle or you are wearing a toupee and glasses. Superheroes realize this, and this is why superheroes wear masks to hide their secret identity. Well, that works better in comic books than in real life because face-to-face authentication isn't only about face recognition, otherwise blind people would never recognize anyone. People also remember each other's voice, build, mannerisms, and so on. If the deli man called his friend on the phone, they could authenticate each other without any visual cues at all. And coincidentally, Commissioner Gordon ought to figure out that Bruce Wayne is really Batman simply because they talk so much on the phone. Anyway, let's go back to the business of buying sausage. All these transactions and authentication works because it's in the real world. What if buying sausage happened online instead? Let's say the same customer who bought the Bratwurst is now surfing the net and wants to buy something a little less perishable. Maybe a painting of a Bratwurst. This guy really likes his sausages. Okay, he fires up his search engine and finds a few websites that sell Bratwurst paintings. They all take credit cards. They all promise delivery in 3 to 4 days. So how does he choose between them? And more importantly, how does the customer know whether to trust them? It doesn't take a lot of effort to put up a storefront. Anyone can do it within a few hours. How do you know which of these merchants are honest and which ones are scams? Even if the URL had a trusted name in the Bratwurst painting business, but how do you know that this URL is actually owned by the person who it says in the name? And there is an even more sinister thought. Who's to say that some illicit hacker hasn't convinced your web browser to display one URL instead of another? The most important security problem to solve is probably authentication across multiple networks. There are as many different solutions to it as there are different requirements. One thing that is important to remember is that there are actually two types of authentication. There is session authentication and transaction authentication. In session authentication, what is being authenticated is the continuity of a particular conversation. So basically, is the person who said something the same person who said something previously? Face-to-face or on the phone, this is easy to do. On the internet, it's a lot harder. Then there is transaction authentication. Then we would be talking about authenticating a credit card purchase or a piece of currency. The authentication there is whether or not the transaction is valid. Whether the merchant and the customer should accept the transaction or should they call the police instead. The issues surrounding this kind of authentication are the same whether or not the transaction is done over the web or over the telephone or face-to-face.